Hi everyone, and welcome to video number 7 on warfare through time, the medieval period. And we're coming towards the end of the medieval period, ladies and gentlemen, and this video, it's case study number 2, the Battle of Agincourt 1415. Now, to give you a little bit of background about what had been happening. It's all to do with England fighting in France, trying to gain control of French land, and it's all part of the 100 Years' War. Now, at the time, Battle of Agincourt, the King of England was a man called King Henry V, and he arrived in France with an army of about 12,000 soldiers. That was about the normal-sized army in the medieval period. In other words, we are looking at continuity. So he arrives with an army of 12,000. He takes the port of Harfleur following a siege. Again, tactics continuing the same. The tactic of siege, we've seen that before. And then he marches through Normandy. In that time, he loses quite a few men to a terrible disease called dysentery. Without going into too much detail, ladies and gentlemen, sort of like an extreme diarrhea, not very pleasant at all, and it was a killer disease. King Henry V himself was to die from the same disease, fighting in France later in the year 1422. So dysentery was a killer disease, and it made a bit of a mess of Henry V's army. So much so that Henry decided to try to march to Calais, to either then get control of Calais, possibly to return to England, but his route was blocked by the French army. Now, Henry's army was weak. He'd lost quite a few men. It was October. They hadn't been eating properly. Remember all the problems of getting food and supplies, particularly in a foreign country. So Henry is in a bit of trouble. And he's marching to Calais. The French army have blocked him near the village of Agincourt. And that leads, ladies and gentlemen, to one of the most famous battles in English history, the Battle of Agincourt, October 1415. Now, it's such a famous battle that later William Shakespeare, the great playwright, wrote a play about Henry V, and a very famous speech by King Henry V on the eve of the battle. And Shakespeare has him saying these words, ladies and gentlemen: "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers, for he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother." Shakespeare's got it straight away. The English army was outnumbered. So, let's have a look at the size of the armies. The English army, approximately round about 8,000. The French army, at least 12,000. Some people say as many as 15,000. So the French have an advantage. They've got a far larger army. They're fighting in their own country. They've got better supplies. They haven't been attacked by dysentery. So you would think everything is set for a French victory. Let's break it down a bit more. Let's have a look at the composition of the armies, that key word for nature of warfare. The English had, out of the 8,000, had about 6,000 infantry, 6,000 foot soldiers, including the longbows, the longbow men, the archers, and they had about 2,000 knights. That's the composition of the English army. The French army, they had about 5,000 infantry or foot soldiers, including archers, or in their case, crossbows. And they had about 10,000 knights. So there's the difference straight away. Now, Henry could not really choose when and where to fight because he's marching to Calais. So he arrives, he's seen that he's blocked off, and sends some scouts out to say, right, where can we fight? And he makes a decision. And he fights near to two woods just outside of Agincourt. Now let's have a look at the position that both armies set up before the battle. Now here we have the map of both armies. The pink, or in case we're a little bit colourblind, ladies and gentlemen, the army at the bottom. This is King Henry V's English army. At the top, the purple, we have the French army. Now let's have a look. First of all, woodland. That's quite a clever choice by King Henry V, because it narrows here. So it's a narrow gap for the French to attack into. Maybe they might all start jostling and nudging each other. So that's one good thing by Henry straight away. How does he set up his army? Well, he's got his knights here, the rectangles. They are dismounted. They are not fighting on horseback. In between, he's got some longbow men, the archers, and then he puts archers or longbows on both flanks, near to the woodlands. Can you see the crosses there, ladies and gentlemen? In front of the archers, Henry gets his men to put wooden stakes aimed forward for protection. That was a very, very good defensive position. So Henry V has done his best. He's outnumbered, his men are tired and weak, but he set them up in a good defensive position. He noticed that the area here between the two armies was very, very heavily ploughed land, made from clay, and had been ploughed up, churned up. It had been raining a huge amount. Therefore, this was very, very, very sticky, almost gloopy or thick mud type land. That'd be important for later. So that's Henry's job. That's the job he's made of the English army. What about the French commander? Well, in the middle here, he's got his knights, dismounted, knights who are ready to fight on foot. At either side, he's got mounted knights, cavalry, knights on horses ready to charge. At the back, he's got his archers, the crossbows. So that is the setup. The distance between the armies is round about 1,000 metres. Remember I said this land was very heavy, very thick. It had been ploughed and it had been raining. The French exercised their horses by running up and down here, churning up the mud even more. Maybe that's an error, ladies and gentlemen. So that is the setup before the battle starts. Now, what actually happens? Henry was desperate for the French to attack. He knows he can't attack because he's outnumbered. But he wants to get through to get to Calais because his men are tired and need support and rest and food. So he wants the French to attack. What does he do? Over here, remember, the longbows. He starts his men firing at the knights. Now, this tactic was called galling. G-A-L-L-I-N-G. Galling. Now, the French were outraged. They said, this is not honourable. This is not chivalrous. This is going against the chivalric code. This is dreadful. We hate this. And they got very, very annoyed. It was a trap by Henry in a way, because the mounted knights, angry, full of rage, disorganised, charged first down here, through the ploughed land, on horseback, churning it up even more. But they had very, very little protection against the arrows. It was a very, very effective tactic by King Henry. And the wooden stakes there are presenting the French cavalry with a very, very severe obstacle. So the mounted knights, if you like, get trapped here on the ploughed land, under attack from the bowmen. What happened next? Well, they start to retreat. because they are being wiped out by the longbows. As they retreat, the dismounted knights, the infantry, are forcing their way through. It is very crowded. Remember, I said it was a narrow gap. People are bumping into each other. The dismounted knights have had to step over all the sort of corpses and the horses that have been killed by the longbows. By the time the dismounted knights have got near the battlefield, they're very, very tired. It's slow. It's poor progress. It's a bit of a mess. It's a bit of a confusion. This is the time that Henry then says, right, we've got them. And he sends in his dismounted knights. And the longbows men, they put down their bows and they also attack. And we have very fierce hand-to-hand fighting in this area, which lasts 2 or 3 hours. At the end of the battle, what's the result? Well, the English have lost about, can't be certain, about 450 soldiers. The French have lost between 3,000 and 4,000, including their top commander, including 3 dukes, 5 counts, 90 barons, loads and loads of their nobles. The French have had a disaster. The English capture some prisoners, but then the French say, right, well, we can go and get those prisoners back. Henry V normally would follow the rule of chivalry, but his army is small, his army is tired, he knows he cannot hold them back anymore, so he takes the very unusual decision of ordering the slaughter of the prisoners. That did not normally happen, but he felt he had to do it to protect his men. The French withdraw. The Battle of Agincourt was over. A huge victory, unexpected, for Henry and his outnumbered army. So there's the events of October 1415. Now, ladies and gentlemen, why did the English army win? Have you got any ideas? Well, here's a couple of points to think about. Number 1, the positioning of the army. Henry had put his army in a very, very good, clever defensive formation. That's the first point. Second point, did the French make mistakes? What do you think? Well, their crossbowmen had hardly any impact in the battle. They're too far away. The crossbow was nowhere near as effective as the longbow. Do you know why? Rate of fire. They could not fire as many arrows as the longbows. And they're too far away, so they're not fully used. That's a big mistake by the French. What else? The French knights, the cavalry, the mounted knights, charged in at the start, enraged by the galling. They were ill-disciplined. It was disorganised, ladies and gentlemen. That's a mistake. Maybe the key point, the role of the longbow. The longbow men were fantastic. 100,000 arrows per minute. Yes, 100,000 arrows per minute. Roughly 1,600, 1,700 arrows per second fired towards the French cavalry from the flanks, protected by the woods, protected by the stakes driven into the ground. Finally, the role of King Henry himself. He seems to have made some good decisions, does he not, ladies and gentlemen? He didn't particularly want to fight, but he had to. He was also a brave warrior, using the new helmet, the bassinet. Gave extra protection, and you could see through the eye slits. It was better ventilated, so you could wear it for longer. He's got good defensive formation, he's got good tactics, the longbow men on the flanks with the stakes for extra support. That was clever. His choice of fighting on the ploughed field with a narrow gap was clever. It's playing to his strengths. It's taking away the strengths of the French, the mounted cavalry. He was also very brave. He fought right at the front of the battle with his crown on his helmet. So much so that afterwards the crown was actually sort of damaged where he'd have been attacked by the French axes in the battle with the helmet and his crown on. He's saying, I am the king. So he's a target, but he's leading by example. So Henry VIII, a brave warrior king, has to take some credit. Now, ladies and gentlemen, one of the key things we've talked about in medieval is change and continuity. Well, we've looked at two battles now, two case studies, both in the medieval period. Battle of Falkirk, early medieval, 1298. Battle of Agincourt, later, 1415. Over 100 years between the two battles. What had changed? What had stayed the same? Well, here's a couple of things for you. First of all, changes. Now then, in the Battle of Falkirk, every knight was mounted. It was cavalry fighting on horseback. At the Battle of Agincourt, most of the English knights were dismounted, fighting on foot. The French had both, mounted and dismounted. So there's one change. A second change. After the battle, King Henry slaughtered the French prisoners. That did not normally happen. It was a one-off because of the conditions that I explained in the video. At the Battle of Falkirk, William Wallace used the schiltrons, the pikes, almost like a wall of spears. Well, they were nowhere to be seen at Agincourt. So there's another change. At Agincourt, the longbows were placed on the flanks. The flanks were becoming a very, very important part of your formation. Not so at the Battle of Falkirk. Henry V used stakes for extra protection. They weren't used at the Battle of Falkirk. And finally, the final change. At the Battle of Falkirk, most of the knights had been recruited using the feudal system, service. I've given you land, you owe me military service. By the time of Agincourt, a lot of the knights were paid for. Indentures, those individual contracts that I mentioned in the previous video. So they're the changes. What about things that continued? Things that stayed the same. At Falkirk, there was hand-to-hand fighting, the melee, exactly the same at Agincourt. At Falkirk, the longbow begins to become a very useful weapon. That continued through the 1300s, Battle of Crécy, Battle of Poitiers, and was right at the very forefront of the victory at the Battle of Agincourt, the longbow. Command. Falkirk, led by King Edward I. Agincourt, led by King Henry V. Falkirk, the Earl of Surrey, the Earl of Lincoln, top knights in charge of the rest of the army. Agincourt, the Duke of York, top knight in charge of other parts of the army. So continuity. Even the campaign itself before the battles. Before the Battle of Falkirk, Edward had gone up into Scotland, tried to siege and take castles up there. Henry V had gone over to France, used siege to take, for example, the port of Harfleur. Continuity, similar tactics. And the final one, the final continuity, what else was the same? roughly the size of the armies. Battle of Falkirk, Battle of Agincourt, the army was fairly similar in size, similar in composition, infantry and knights in both battles. So there we have some things that stayed the same and some changes across the medieval period, looking at the two case studies, those two key battles. So that's the end of medieval warfare, ladies and gentlemen. Now, using chronology, correct use of time, what's coming next? Bonus points for anybody who said the early modern period, 1500 to 1700. What was happening then in English warfare? What was the nature of warfare after 1500? What was the experience of warfare after 1500? Well, as ever, the next set of videos hopefully will explain that to you. As ever, I hope it's been useful. Just to take away some ideas from the video. 1982, Sheffield band, ABC, had a very famous hit. Shoot that poison arrow to my heart. Shoot that poison arrow. Well, it was all about arrows at Agincourt, ladies and gentlemen. ABC, Agincourt, bowmen conquer. Can you see what I did there? Terrible, I know. To finish, just with a short poem. With Henry's tactic of galling, the French advance was stalling. The knights continued falling. They were given a dreadful mauling. There's Agincourt summed up. The arrows beat the French knights. As ever, hope it's been useful. Speak to you soon. Bye now.